There are times when we're direct and we're bold and we call stuff out and where we speak truth to power. I don't want to come across as saying those aren't real times where we need to speak out. We have a whole biblical tradition of the prophets, calling out injustice, and that needs to happen. But I think before we go to those more intense forms of communication, we try to start however we can with regard for the other person, regard for their intentions. And as the conversation moves on, it may need to take a different approach, but treating others with respect and giving ourselves permission to have boundaries and not to engage with everything. You're not called to win every argument, and you're not called even to enter into every argument. So give yourself grace to sometimes just walk away and catch your breath.
Welcome back to Advent Next, a theological podcast curated for curious faith discussions. This is part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Seth Pierce as we talk about helpful tips and tools for tackling difficult conversations, improving communication, and developing interpersonal skills. Dr. Seth, professor of communication, is author of the book Seeking and Understanding: How to Have Difficult Conversations Without Destroying Relationships. Before we dive in, we want to thank the Adventist Learning Community for making this program possible. If you're not already following us on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube, be sure to find us at the handle @AdventNext. You can follow our guest today, Dr. Seth Pierce, on Twitter at Seth J. Pierce, and me at Kendra R. Snow with an X. But right now, this is Advent Next. When it comes to, you talked something about like fundamental attribution error. So what is that, and how can we avoid it as one of our principles of communication?
So I love this term. This is a term I learned earlier on in my doctoral experience. This is something I know we've all experienced this, but as a pastor, I experienced this myself. I'm guilty of it and saw parishioners doing it. And it was always a thing that I didn't have a term for. I could just see it happening. And so this term, fundamental attribution error, essentially refers to assigning internal motives to external actions. We have this tendency when someone does something, we immediately, judge that action, say, well, this is why they did that. And we haven't asked them any questions. We don't know for sure. Certainly in some cases we've clear evidence for motive, but a lot of times we just go about assigning these internal motives. Really easy way to illustrate this is if you set up a business lunch with somebody and they're, late, or you are for whatever reason, and they get there and immediately like, well, this person's disrespecting me. This person is disorganized, and they may have had car trouble. They may have, hit a deer or something on the way over, or, they may have something else emotionally going on in their life that's just sapping their mental energy and making it hard for them. There's a lot of reasons, but we will kind of go to that negative, right away, and then we'll respond to them, based on that internal motive we assigned without really, much evidence except this sort of one isolated incident. There's a really Luke 6:38 is a passage that a lot of us are familiar with, usually applied to offering calls. Give and it's given to you, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, we put into your lap. And when you read that verse in context, you realize it's not talking about money. It's talking about how gracious we are with each other's reputations. It's talking about, if I am gracious with other people's reputations, then that grace will be given back to me. It's not talking about, whether I pay tithes and offerings. Right. And this is something, again, in our current media ecology and the way persuaders and propagandists are manipulating things, we are being taught to pass those very quick judgments on people's motivations. And this certainly isn't me saying people shouldn't be accountable or anything like that. Yeah. But there is certainly, I think, a reduction in our willingness to be gracious to each other. And when you have that element in play, it becomes really difficult to get an understanding of what's going on in the other person's life. Now, we may find out that they did have a bad motive, and then that's a different situation. But we often will start there, and that's a really difficult place to start a conversation from when I've already judged you as having a bad character and you're out to get me.
Yeah. But what do we do in situations like, how do we apply this to maybe a difficult conversation? Something that we might be in tension about, whether it's gender equality or race discrimination or maybe something political, right? How do we, is there a way that we can apply this where somebody seems to be taking a stance that is contrary to ours, and it feels like they are revealing something internal about themselves, a bad motive. Is there a
Sure.
way that we can, reinterpret that, or?
Yeah, there's a couple different things. I have a friend of mine, colleague Aaron Jones, who does all kinds of diversity training, largely in the Pacific Northwest, but all over the place. And she was invited in to do a presentation with us pastors in Washington conference. And in her talk, we certainly acknowledge that there are people with ill intent and people who are willfully, just mean and prejudice and bad. But often she says people are ignorant, and it's easier for me to respond to somebody to start with, to say, this post that was made about gender or race, I need to address it, perhaps, because it's I don't believe it's correct, or it's repeating, debunked, ideas or whatever. But I want to make sure I'm responding to the content of the post without calling them names or somehow suggesting that the reason they posted it is because, they hate, whatever the context is. So I start by addressing the issues. I've had a couple of really good recent experiences where one was a conversation about gender and feminism and a couple other things that happened. I don't remember totally the specifics. It's about 6 months ago, but I got in there and I didn't go after the person. Just said, here's some research, and here's in terms of my perspective as a communication scholar, here's what I know, and cited some sources, and didn't talk about their motive for posting, didn't talk about, I didn't know them, but they actually responded really well, like, oh, I didn't know that, which would have been a different response had I gone after them and said, look, you misogynist, whatever, and gone after it that way, because now they may be, who knows, they may double down, and that certainly happens too, where you see people kind of doubling down on their ignorance and then getting really awful about it. But a lot of times what I find is people will post up, even if it just grates on me. And again, it's one of those moments like I need to wait 24 hours before I jump into this, just to let things cool down, but focus on the issue without going after the character of the person. Now, again, they may reveal some of their character and how they respond, and I may get a better sense of things. But the other thing too, to keep in mind, I found many times, not all the time, but many times when people are really visceral in their responses, sometimes I've because there's a network of pastors and we talk. That's everyone should just know that. I might say, hey, I had this really strange interaction, and do you know this person? And come to find out they've been through a recent trauma. They've got some other stuff going on, and while they may be taking it out on me or a particular issue, it's not really about that. There's other stuff going in, and that's helped me many times respond to church members where I realize, okay, this is really irritating and ignorant and frustrating, but I also recognize, that they've had some extreme loss in their life recently, and they're in a bad spot. And if I was in their place, I would need a little bit of grace. Not that you don't address the issue, but you try not to go after the person because they're already pretty beat up. Now, the other thing that I found helpful, another kind of pro tip for online exchanges, is using direct messaging versus jumping into threads on social media. Threads, and we've all seen it derail really quickly because people who don't know each other jump into conversations and replies. And I seldom engage anymore, particularly on Facebook. I very rarely post in threads anymore, just because all these other people will jump in who don't know me or don't know the other, and it just becomes a mess. So I direct message someone when they make a post that either I really like or that's inspiring or I have questions on, and I start very gentle, and I just make a comment or a question. So they say, hey, I might say, I saw you posted this, and I'm wrestling with it. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you think, how I'm hearing it is this way? What do you think? And it really opens up this space for a much healthier conversation that isn't get interrupted by other people. Other times in the exchange, if I am in a thread and I can sense that it's ratcheting up a little bit, that's when I'll kind of dip out and DM the person. And I've had really amazing experiences where I've learned a ton from that other person, from where they're coming from. And sometimes when I could see where the argument was going, it stopped the hostility, and I've made friends and colleagues that we now work together, just because I recognize that again, that's the whole medium thing. That medium of being in a thread is not conducive to really good a conversation, things get lost in translation. So I pivoted, went to the direct messages, and it was much healthier. Now to do this well, you can't go on the attack. Don't like DM somebody. And I had one of my former intern pastor just posted something, and some random dude went after her on Instagram, all kinds of invectives and insults and terrible stuff. And so even if you're provoked, don't start well, like on the attack. Direct message, keep it short, humble, and gentle. Say, hey, I'm struggling to understand. Can you help me? Also, just as a pro tip, there's a lot of creeps that try to slide into women's DMs. So make sure your comments are on topic. And ideally, you should know the person somewhat personally before you just like jump into someone's direct messages.
Right. Yeah. What do you say to people who have kind of been in some like online battles and they're just like, you know what, it's not even worth it anymore. Like, I don't feel like commenting. I don't want to correct this. I don't want to participate in the online form of communication because I just see it as a hopeless endeavor. Like, people don't change. Like, how would you encourage them to, to get back in that community, or what is your advice to someone who's like a little bit disenfranchised and disenchanted?
I think boundaries are good in communication and relationships. And sometimes you recognize, I'm not getting any life from this, and I'm not giving anybody life from this. So maybe it's better that I take and even if you don't leave forever, sometimes people just, I need a break. I just need to log off for a while, or I'm going to switch platforms, or sometimes I'm going to go through and I'm just going to curate my following a little bit. This gets harder when you're a pastor because you look like you're playing favorites. You can't, someone who you may disagree with, they still consider you a pastoral figure or someone who they've connected, your creative work they've connected with. And so it's trickier, but it's not bad for many people to just sort of go through and say, there's a few people who are toxic, and it's not helpful for anybody, to maintain this. And so you may unfollow sometimes. That way I don't get, if you don't want to unfriend somebody, you unfollow them. That way you don't see their posts, don't have to worry about it. But yeah, there's not a general rule except for, know your boundaries and know when it's affecting your quality of life. But I have seen some very encouraging conversations happen. I have seen people interact where there has been, even if the opinions don't change, they get more nuanced a little bit. And I've watched people who are diametrically opposed somehow develop this, it's like a friendly antagonistic relationship, and they actually end up really liking each other because they agree over certain things. They just have a few issues they sort of expect each other to engage with, but there's a good camaraderie there. I think there has to be a base level of respect. On any of my pages, I kind of watch for if people start insulting each other or it gets nasty, you're out. I'll just block you right away. Like there's a certain level of baseline of respect that you can disagree, you can be passionate about it. But we all have our own boundaries, and I communicate that pretty clearly. Like, this is my expectation. If we're going to continue this dialogue, have it, be passionate, but don't call names. But we all have to kind of figure out where those boundaries are.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked a little bit about seeing meaning. Meanings are in people and not in words. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so this is kind of a basic idea of communication theory is meanings are in people, not words. One of the barriers to intercultural communication I talk about in my book is assumed similarity, which means I assume other people, they like what I like, they hate what I hate, and these assumptions are so ingrained. I mean, who doesn't like pizza, right? Who doesn't like chocolate? I have relatives who don't, and I don't understand how they're part of my family. Like, are you sure that you're related to me? What's wrong with you? So we just assume these things. We're not even aware that they're assumptions. And these can be seen in how we define terms. For example, if you say feminism or Black Lives Matter, I could be meaning one thing and somebody else thinks I mean another based on their experiences. And so what ends up happening is you can even use the term Adventism, and people are going to have a host of reactions to that term. Someone's going to use a term such as one of these, and others are going to react to it based on their definitions and their experiences and the meanings they've assigned to it. But words and language are symbols, and they change, and they're fluid. And so the word cat is meaningless in Mongolia. It doesn't make any sense. But here in our English language system, it makes total sense. It refers to a house pet that most of us, I've got two of them, and so totally makes sense. And we do this with theological terms in the pulpit. We'll throw terms around when we're preaching, just assuming everybody knows what 1844 means, what the sanctuary refers to. And they don't, they may not, or they think of something completely different. So based on our personal experiences in education, we tend to come at terms very differently. And one of the problems, one of the analogies I use to illustrate the problems that can happen in these conversations, I'm not a handy person, I'm not a maintenance person, I have very small DIY skills, but what I've been told is if you do tile work and that first tile is crooked, the whole project, whether it's a shower or the floor, the whole thing is going to be crooked. And if we start our conversations defining terms differently, I've watched so many conversations between intelligent, good intentioned people, but they define a term based on two very different experiences, and I watch these people just talk past each other, and they're not, they may realize they're actually not on opposing sides, but they have opposing definitions of the term, and so when we enter these conversations, or especially if we're going to preach on something that tends to be emotionally or politically charged, we have to really make sure that we're defining our terms very clearly and saying, when I come at this concept, here is what I mean by that, versus what you may be thinking.
Yeah, no, I think that's so key. How can we have a conversation if we're not on the same page in the beginning?
Right.
Yeah. One thing I think that you brought up that I think is really important, check your sources. And I think that that's something that I've had to do for a couple of friends. They've sent me stuff that's very fanatical, and they've, you get the big long emails and they're like, you need to check this out. Don't do this, or anyway, and you have to say, well, actually, some of the sources that you cited were incorrect. That's an uncomfortable conversation, but talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so want to affirm that, check your sources, and it can be simple. If you get an article, read the title of it, the subject of it, and then a quick Google search or whatever search engine you use, and you'll find out oftentimes that was something that was debunked even 6 months ago. 2 years ago. It's not even new, but because it shows up on these other websites, it looks new. And that's the other thing. We need to check the sources of our sources. We need to go even deeper. So especially for online posts, people will send emails, and you mentioned articles, memes, op-ed pieces where the title is relevant or confirms our biases. But if you would look at the source that it's shared from, there's a lot of problems. Often, even just a few minutes researching the history of a news organization yields a picture of their track record in terms of journalistic integrity, their vetting process. And so if you've got this source that you've cited an article from, and then you realize that it's not just this article that's problematic, but the source it comes from is like the National Enquirer, or it's got it's been, or the news source was like created 2 weeks ago in someone's basement. Right. There's not, it's not, doesn't have a lot of what we would consider really, really good checks and balances to determine what's coming out of there. And likely when the wilder the claims that we're getting, the more clickbaity or emotional the titles, it's usually kind of a flag that this is a site that's simply trying to provoke us into giving it attention versus careful reporting from a newsroom that's been around for a while, that's established, that has processes that have been vetted. That's not to say that just legacy news and media is the only sources we go to, but checking, just doing a check on any news source, not just the article, to see where am I getting this from? Is this a place that's considered reputable, or is it embroiled in all kinds of legal and lawsuit battles that I probably don't want to be citing things from?
Yeah, no, I think it's, goes back to being a Berean in that sense, right?
Yes.
I think that's always been the call, check the scriptures, check the sources, be somebody who doesn't just take something for face value. And it takes work, and especially the internet can feel like the Wild Wild West, but
yes,
it's possible. Lastly, what is invitational rhetoric?
Invitational rhetoric comes from Sonia Foss and Cindy Griffin in the mid-90s. When we look at rhetoric, typically like classical rhetoric, it's meant to win arguments. We look at things like syllogisms and enthymemes and logos, ethos, pathos, all those kind of things to build an argument, a real a soundly structured argument to beat our opponent in a debate, in court, those kinds of things. And in the mid-90s, these two scholars said maybe there's a different way to approach persuasion that isn't geared to scoring points or attacking the integrity of our perceived opponent. And so invitational rhetoric has three main values: equality, self-determination, and inherent value. So even if it's painful for me, when I have to admit the other person, they have an inherent value. And as a Christian, we recognize this is somebody who Jesus died for. This is somebody who Jesus loves. Whether I feel that love in my heart or not, I have to admit that. And we believe in self-determination, meaning I'm not going to manipulate them. I'm not going to manipulate images and content or use language games to try to catch them, and manipulate them into or overpower them to embrace my position. And equality, recognizing they've got a perspective that maybe I need to hear. And so what they suggest is when we enter into these discussions, we start by asking for people's story. Well, tell me how you came to that position. Tell me your story. And then are you open to me telling my story? And what often happens is because we're not directly attacking each other, we're just sharing, our journeys. It's often more persuasive than had I directly attacked them in the first place. I never thought of that. Oh, that makes sense. Even at the end, if we don't come to an agreement on stuff, at least I understand you. At least I understand, I may not have that conclusion, but I understand how you would get there, and I can affirm that. And it just makes for better dialogue, and that kind of gets at the title of the book as well, seeking an understanding. Before we can seek solutions, we have to take time to understand each other. Otherwise, whatever engagement we have is going to end up being toxic.
Yeah, no, I love that. I really appreciate the points that you brought, how to begin to engage and navigate difficult conversations without breaking relationships. And as always, I want to give you kind of the last piece and the last moment to kind of say some things to our audience that you might not have mentioned about, how do we navigate this kind of very polarized and incendiary world of social media, but also just various different political opinions, even within inside the church. How do we begin to navigate those and still have some type of semblance of brotherly, sisterly camaraderie and love?
Yeah, I mean, bringing it back to the words of Christ, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them, do unto you, kind of an idea. Just taking stock of the way we communicate, how we communicate, and saying, if I'm going to engage with somebody, if I'm going to put myself in the other person's shoes, what is likely to be heard, what is not likely to be heard, what's going to make me feel attacked and diminish, my inherent value, and is that really how I need to communicate? And again, there are times when we're direct and we're bold and we call stuff out and where we speak truth to power. I don't want to come across as saying those aren't real times where we need to speak out. I mean, we have a whole biblical tradition of the prophets, calling out injustice, and that needs to happen. But I think before we go to those more intense forms of communication, we try to start however we can with regard for the other person, regard for their intentions. And as the conversation moves on, it may need to take a different approach. But a lot of us, I think, are, especially during a pandemic, everyone has been destabilized. And when you're destabilized, we're all groping for narratives to make sense of what's happening. And propagandists know this, and so they will put things out there, oversimplified solutions, polarizing solutions. And so again, taking the time, to slowly process things, treating others with respect, and giving ourselves permission to have boundaries and not to engage with everything. You're not called to win every argument, and you're not called even to enter into every argument. So give yourself grace to sometimes just walk away and catch your breath.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate you sharing with us today. Where can people find your book? Where can they find more material from you? How can they follow you?
Yeah, so the book is available on Amazon.com and AdventSource.org, I believe. I think it's back, but I know the paperback, I think it's sold out. The Kindle version is still on Amazon, but I think that the more paper copies are coming. But AdventSource.org is where you can order it directly. You can follow me at Professor Pierce on Instagram, and you can follow me on Twitter, where I'm probably the most active, at Seth J. Pierce. And also you can find me on Facebook. Again, I'm not as active on Facebook, but Twitter and Instagram are where I spend most of my time.
I hope this conversation placed a few mindful tools into your tool bag as you begin to tackle difficult conversations while maintaining relationships. For a more in-depth look on improving your communication, you can check out Dr. Pierce's book, Seeking and Understanding. If you're not already following us on Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram, be sure to do so at Advent Next. You can follow our guest today, Dr. Seth Pierce, on Twitter at Seth J. Pierce, and you can follow me at Kendra Arsenault with an X. I just want to say thank you to those of you who have left reviews on Apple Podcasts or are engaging in the comments through YouTube. I really love hearing from you, so if you enjoyed this discussion or topics like these, please leave a review on Apple Podcast or send me a request to cover various topics that you're interested in. Thanks so much for tuning in, and see you next week.